We'll call this joint meeting of the City Council and School Board's Finance committees to order. We'll do introductions first. I'm Nick Mavadonis. I'm an at-large counselor and chair of this committee. On the city side, let me see if I can get this right. The members of our committee are Councilor Fournier, Councilor Dion, and Mayor Snyder. In addition, we have Councilor Chong, and Councilor Ray has not arrived yet. She's at a Metro meeting. I think if I missed an elected official, I'm sorry. Our city manager, John Jennings, is here. Brendan O'Connell from Finance, Tiffany Mullen from Finance is helping us manage the meeting. I think I've got everybody from the city side. Anna, how do you guys want to do introductions? Everybody has a different system.
I'll go across the screen and see. Hopefully I get everybody right. So we have Kathy Wincham back. She's our Director of Finance. She's new to us this year, so I don't know if everybody's met her yet, but she just gave us a wave. Aura Russellbetter is our District 4 school board member. Adam Burke is District 3. He is a member of the Finance Committee. Ann Rothaker, she is the Executive Secretary to Javier. Then we have Roberto Rodriguez, who's at-large board member and member of the Finance Committee. Emily Figdor, chair of the board. Emily Chung is our student rep, who's a member of the Finance Committee. Malia Nally, assistant superintendent. Gavin Goodall, he's our new data and technology director. Javier Botana, superintendent. Grace Valenzuela. Grace, what is your current title?
I'm the Communications and the Family Community Partnership Director for Portland Public Schools.
Thank you. Yusuf we have, who's at-large member of the school board. Gail Cressy. Gail, I'm forgetting your title as well. Sorry.
Director. I'm the Director of Intervention Strategy, and I am on the academic team with Malia, and I do support around building our budget.
Okay, thank you. And then we also have Henry Guide, who's not on camera tonight, but he's our Channel 3 guy.
And I missed District 4 Councilor Zaro, who is also with us. Some problem scrolling these. You did a better job than I did, Anna. So our agenda tonight is partly with the school board, and then we'll have a little bit to do with the council finance committee ourselves. We're bound by the charter to have two joint meetings. It also makes good sense to have joint meetings. So that's what we're doing this evening. And I'm just going to turn it back to you guys. Anna, are you kicking off, or is Javier?
I think we have a presentation for you to just give you a rundown of where we are with our budget. And then we would be taking your feedback, questions, and et cetera. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to Javier.
Thanks.
Thank you, Anna. And I don't know, Tiffany, can I share my screen so that I could run the presentation?
You should have that ability. So unless someone else is attempting to do that.
At the bottom of the screen, there's a green share screen button. Oh, there we go.
Can you see it?
Yep.
Awesome. So good evening, everyone, members of the City Council, Finance Committee, other members of the City Council, Portland Public Schools, board members, to members of our team and the city's team, as well as members of the public. I appreciate the opportunity to bring you my proposed FY22 budget. This budget I presented to the Board of Education on March 16th, and this is my first opportunity to share it publicly with the council. This is my fifth budget that I've brought to you and to the school board in my time here in the Portland Public Schools. And I can say with certainty that this is by far the budget that I'm most proud of. It is, it's commonly said that a budget reflects an organization's values, and I can tell you that this budget reflects my values, but I think more importantly, it reflects the values of our institution. By and large, it reflects the values of our staff, our community. So, as I said, it's something that I'm very proud of. It is the result of a tremendous amount of work by many people. I think to recognize and thank the members of my cabinet who are here with me today, as well as our school leaders and the many partners to our organization, both inside and outside, that have helped us to shape this. And I would especially like to thank Kathy Winchembach, who you just met earlier, who's our new Director of Budget and Finance, and walked into the process midway and has done a tremendous job of helping us to lead through this. I also want to recognize members of the school board for their for their guidance and support in crafting this budget, and up to now with the review from our finance committee. So this budget, as you know, is happening a little over a year from when the coronavirus pandemic changed the face of our schools, our city, and the world. This year's budget theme is advancing equity. And equity has always been an important part of the Portland Promise, as you've heard me talk about before, so since its inception. But this budget accelerates our commitment to putting equity at the center of our Portland Promise. Indeed, to represent this, our Portland Promise graphic, which most of you have seen over and over, has been revised to reflect this evolution in our commitments. The coronavirus pandemic has made indisputable the longstanding disparities that exist between different groups of students in our schools. While as a community, we relish our diversity and see it as a strength, we've often failed to recognize that the disparities in those opportunities for our students exist for the students who are learning English, who have disabilities, or are economically disadvantaged. And this lack of recognition is belies our sincerity in that commitment. This past year, it became evident that government institutions, including our school system, have failed to recognize, to realize their potential for creating a more inclusive, just, and equitable world. And this is an example of that. As you can see, this is this year's data. The percentage of students who are chronically absent has grown dramatically, particularly among our BIPOC students. And the same is true if we look at our English language learners and our special education students. The proposed budget, which brings the proposed budget, which assumes a full return to in-person learning in the fall, takes steps to redress this pattern by targeting resources to the students to whom we owe the largest educational debt. Those who are learning English, have disabilities, or are harassed, discriminated, or otherwise alienated in our schools. This commitment to remove barriers is at the heart of our equity goal, which is part of our Portland Promise. My FY21 budget proposal attempted to advance many of the same priorities I will be talking to you about shortly. My initial proposal called for an increase in the tax rate of 3%. Shortly after that proposal, as you will recall, we pulled back on most of those initiatives, and we did so in response to the uncertainty posed to us by the pandemic. We ultimately approved a budget that did not increase taxes and also did not advance many of those priorities. Prior to that, we had made strides towards realizing the Portland Promise. In FY19, we established that student access to challenging core content required strong, uniform support, orchestrated centrally by skilled and dedicated academic leaders. We also strengthened our support for our students' social emotional development and emphasized making sure that we had the ability to help them have a meaningful relationship with a caring adult. In FY20, we expanded on those commitments as the board vowed to expand access to pre-kindergarten over the next 4 years, and we also created a behavioral health continuum across our elementary, middle, and most of our high schools. Our goal with the budget that we've proposed is to advance those commitments, to advance our equity goal while maintaining our current programs and services and making smart use of federal funding that's available to help us supplement our local budget capacity and accelerate our students' learning. Remember these three themes, because these are the three themes that I will be talking about as we go through this budget. There are $2.9 million in investments that are associated with these three themes. Consistent with our budget theme, the largest portion is for advancing equity. So I'm sorry, this is the slide that shows you how that's distributed. So 2.4 million is towards advancing equity, and then about 500,000 is going to the other two initiatives that I will be talking about. So let's talk a little bit about advancing equity. In this area, we're proposing to continue to fulfill the commitment to the pre-kindergarten promise that was established in 2019 by increasing seats and reducing barriers. One of the barriers that we know exists to our families being able to take advantage of our pre-kindergarten seats is transportation. And so this year's budget includes the resources necessary so that we are able to transport all of our students that need transportation to their pre-kindergarten seats. It also implements significant components of our LAU plan. Our LAU plan is our state plan to provide supports for our students who are learning English, our English language learners. This plan, which I'll talk about the specifics of what that entails, is designed to ensure that we can provide the commitment that we have as a community to our students who are learning English, and our proposed budget advances significant components of that. Our proposals allow us to continue to prioritize core instruction, teaching and learning, particularly with a focus on equity and rigor. It allows us to advance the planning work and the implementation of work that we've engaged in with broad segments of the community around our Wabanaki Studies curriculum and a new curriculum that we're calling our Africana Studies. It allows us to continue our focus on math instruction and our literacy equity work. It allows us to begin to implement the STEM plan, science, technology, engineering, and math, that we've developed. And it also allows us to begin the process of developing and implementing a new formative assessment strategy, something that will allow us to measure on an ongoing basis how our students are doing and being able to tailor our supports based on what that data tells us. We're also proposing to accelerate our staff diversity and inclusion work. Some of the things that are included under that is compensating staff appropriately for what we call identity-based work. That's work that we ask our employees to take on because of who they are, because of the languages that they speak, because of their identities and their ability to connect with students and with each other based on those identities, and recognizing that that's an attribute that is deserving of compensation. It's also allowing us to create career pathways so that we have opportunities for our teachers, our ed techs, our base employees to be able to move through their career ladders into other roles in the organization. And it also allows us to recruit and support BIPOC educators into the Portland Public Schools. It allows us to operationalize structures that will enable us as a district to recognize and redress harassment, sexual harassment, and discrimination. The board passed a policy in October, which is a revision to our harassment, sexual harassment, and discrimination policy. And as part of that, there's a significant amount of effort in training and in supporting school work and being able to investigate and close out and follow up on investigations. And so in the budget are the resources necessary for us to be able to do that work. It also makes key investments to support students with disabilities, specifically by allowing us to complete our autism continuum, a continuum of services for students at the elementary and the middle school and the high school that are on the ASD spectrum. It also allows us to add staffing at the high school level for our functional life skills program. And this is directly tied to the need to provide services to a significant number of students who are older than 20, younger than 22, who are now allowed to continue to receive services through the school system as a result of the State Department of Education's directives around that. And it allows us to institutionalize the district's equity work by allowing us to support our diversity, equity, and inclusion director position through the general fund. We've been able to support this role for the past 3 years with the generous support from the Gorman Foundation initially and the Barr Foundation and a smattering of existing federal funds. And so this moves that position into our general fund, recognizing that that role is critical to our ability to advance the work that we're trying to do as a district around diversity, equity, and inclusion. This is how the $2.4 million that we are proposing for this purpose breaks out. As you can see, the largest of those is the support for our LAU plan. That's the plan to support our students who are learning English. And the resources there are going to things such as increasing the number of ELL teachers so that we can have one per grade level in most of our elementary schools, the schools that have large numbers of ELL students, and then also in every other grade in the schools that have less concentration of that. The purpose of that is to be able to have the level of collaboration between regular classroom teachers and ELL teachers to make sure that all of our students are getting the support that they need while they're still in the core, receiving the core curriculum in their classroom. We also have a significant investment in our diversity and hiring support. So that I talked a little bit about some of the roles that are associated with that, and a part of that is to create a position in our human resources department that will lead that work as part of creating those career pathways and supporting our existing staff of color. Next, we want to learn from what we have experienced this year with COVID and try to advance some of the work that has resulted from that. Specifically, we're looking to expand and institutionalize our outdoor learning. We came to this idea because of our understanding that students would be able to learn with less risk during COVID in outdoor settings. And we've learned a lot about how beneficial that is for students, that goes beyond the safety and health issues, but also in terms of their ability to just learn better in an outdoor setting. And so we have a tremendous amount of community support for this, and we're looking to expand and institutionalize that so that it isn't just something that we do during COVID, but something that becomes part of how we function as a school system. Another part of that is supporting the integration of the significant investments that we've made in new technology using federal funds this year so that we can actually support teachers in being able to use that, not just for remote learning, but also to leverage it for better learning in the classroom day in and day out. We have other aspects of of the work that we've done this year that we want to also carry over into the coming year. And so those things are not in the general fund budget, but those are things that we would look to advance using our federal funds. So this is how those costs are broken out into the budget, into the general fund budget, support for our technology integration and support for outdoor learning. And those are two positions primarily to help us to support that work. And then the final piece, the final priority is rebuilding our foundation. And so when we talk about that, what we're saying is we know that this has been a difficult year for our students, for our staff, for our community as a whole. And we need to look at how do we build back to where we were prior to the pandemic and beyond. And so when we talk about this, this notion of rebuilding the foundation, we're talking about investing in both physical and mental health. So it's investment in nursing and social work services within the school system, as well as creating support structures that allow us to rebuild the learning foundation for all of our students. You know, a robust summer school experience, ongoing supports for students over the course of the school year, and the type of support structures that allow us to do that. And so in the general fund budget, you see that we have $275,000, and that will support some additional nurse staffing and significant investments in social work across our schools. The budget book that you've seen also has all of the details around which schools and programs those investments are associated with. So again, just to recap, this is our total additional investments in those three themes. And so these are the investments that we believe are consistent with our values as a school system and addressing the present and looking into the future as we look to advance equity and make the school system be the school system that we all want it to be. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kathy Winchenbach to walk you through some of the finances associated with this budget. So we're going to get into some of the details for the finances. And I don't know, Anna and Nick, if you want to pause now and ask any questions about the investments that we're proposing, or if you want to do this portion of it and then move into the finances.
I think it may make sense to ask some questions at this point. So let me see if any counselors have questions. Let's see. I see Tay has his hand up. Go ahead, Tay.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Superintendent Botana. I really like this proposal. I just had a couple questions. My first question was, I think it was like on your slides around the absentee students.
Yeah.
You mentioned that the Hispanic students. It seems like there's a huge surge. The absentee rate was like 30 some odd %. It was much higher than everyone else. And also, in fact, all the students of color actually had a higher percentage of absentee rates versus white students, but everybody saw an increase. My question is, do you in this budget, is there anything specific around bilingual social workers or truant officers working with the Hispanic population or some of the other multilingual populations to find out why they're being chronically absent and what kind of services they might need? Yeah. That's my first question. And then if you want to answer that, I'll just ask the second question.
Yeah. So in the social work positions, they're not specifically targeted to any particular position. We are looking to add a social work position in our multilingual, multicultural center. That's something that we had in the past and that we need to bring back. And we have this year been working with Blanca Santiago, who retired from the school system and is a social worker who's also Latinx, and she is mentoring social workers who are BIPOC. And Blanca and I talked yesterday, and she has 3 people that she believes are ready and willing to come work in the Portland Public Schools. So we're looking at having a pool of social workers of color that we are able to tap to bring in to fill some of those positions. In terms of the Latinx number, you can see that was, that group, the Native American is a very small group, so there tends to be more fluctuations. But the Latinx group was already our highest in terms of chronically absent. So we are very cognizant of the fact that is our reality, and it's obviously increased very significantly during the pandemic. And if you look at this at the high school, I believe it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 plus % of our Latinx students that are chronically absent. So that is, absolutely an area that we need to focus our energy and our resources. We also have a very high correlation between ELL and our Latinx population, probably more so even than with our Black African American population. And so the investments that we're making in that area are also helping us to make sure that we can have those ongoing connections with our Latinx students. Assistant Superintendent Nally is also leading an effort to really try to figure out how can we leverage the services at the Portland Arts and Technology High School paths as a hook to get students, particularly Latinx students, into school. Is one of the things that we know anecdotally and is also consistent with the national data is that unlike some of our other BIPOC students, many of our Latinx students do not have the same access to post-secondary education as others because of their immigration status. And so the extent to which we can help them to acquire, real life skills that they're able to then parlay into better paying positions that will then allow them to pursue their post-secondary dreams. That's something that we need to be able to do. So Malia and her team are invested in having that happen. I'm sorry, I went a lot farther afield.
No, you and I could talk about this forever, and I totally support that idea. I just hope that, if there's any step level for multilingual social workers, outreachers, it would be great if the Portland school system could reward people for their language abilities as well as their other degrees, because the population is so diverse. And you and I both know that Hispanic Americans have some of the lowest graduation rates, and the test scores that you've shown us, it's the Black and brown students, particularly Hispanic American students, that are actually scoring lower consistently. And so it seems to me that that and the triple number of absentee numbers for African American or Black students is a place where more social workers who have that multilingual and multicultural background would be beneficial. I think it's great to hire anyone of color, but having language is going to be so important to reach these families. So that was I just wanted to throw that out there. My second question is, I think it's wonderful to have Wabanaki and Africana studies. Is there any, are there plans to also look at Latinx and Asian studies as well? Is that going to be the next iteration?
That would be the next iteration. I think we started in Wabanaki studies because there's been a 20-year mandate to do that, and we really did not have a strong presence there. And so we're really proud of the work that our team, led by Fiona Hopper, has done to really engage with that community in an authentic way to develop that curriculum. And, from my first day visiting Portland, the need, the desire on the part of our students to have curriculum that they could see themselves represented by has been, front and center. So that's the Africana studies work that we're now doing, using the same model that we did with the Wabanaki studies to really engage in an authentic way with that community to develop that curriculum so that it's not the educators dictating this is what we're going to do, but really understanding what are the attributes, what are the strengths in the community, and then helping to use that to build our curriculum out from that. And that's the same process that we need to follow for all of our different identities, for LGBTQ students, for Latinx, for Asian, for all of the multiple identities that we have in our schools.
Great. Thank you.
I don't see any other hands up on this part of the presentation. So unless one goes up quickly, I think we can move on to Kathy.
Great. Kathy, I'll just keep driving, so just tell me next slide.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Good evening. I'm Kathy Wincham-Batch. As the superintendent mentioned, this next section will review the financial aspects of the superintendent's proposed budget. So next slide, please. We start the financial section with an overview of our FY22 budget data points compared to last year's final approved budget. And as we saw earlier, our FY22 proposed budget is currently $125.8 million. This compares to $119.9 million from last year. The increase from last year is 5%. This compares to last year's increase of over FY20 of 2.1%, and the school tax rate increase of 6.29% compared to a 0% increase last year. Next slide, please. So this slide compares FY20 actual, the FY21 approved budget, and the FY22 proposed budget. The changes noted in blue are comparing the FY22 proposed budget to the FY21 approved budget. And as we can see from this slide, the proposed property tax levy increased by almost $7 million, or 7.4%. The state EPS subsidy, which does not include here the state-approved debt service reimbursement, decreased by $85,000 or 5.6%, and then all other revenue decreased slightly. And on the expense side, our salary and benefits, which include temporary salary and benefits, are the majority of this budget at 79%. This number includes COLA adjustments, grade and step changes for both the bargaining and non-bargaining groups. And also salary and benefits include differentials and all of our investments, which we have discussed previously. All other expenditures increased by $781,000 or 3.1%. And we'll describe some of the major non-salary expense drivers in the following slides. And as noted earlier, the expenditure budget has increased by 5%. So next slide, please. We can see that the property tax levy has increased by approximately $7 million. The property tax valuation has increased by $85 million. And this has resulted in a 74-cent or 6.29 increase in the school tax rate. And what we would like to note in this slide is that due to the increase in the city valuation, we're able to increase our property tax levy by approximately $1 million before we see an increase in the tax rate. And stated another way, the increase in valuation is absorbing some of the tax impact. And then thereafter, each percentage increase in the tax rate yields approximately $953,000 in property tax revenue and represents an approximate 12 cents tax rate increase. Next slide, please. So this slide just summarizes the previous slide that the FY22 superintendent's proposed budget adds 74 cents to the school portion of the tax rate for a total school tax rate of $12.43. And until the city revaluation, we're showing an example of an average home value to $250,000, representing an annual increase in property taxes of about $184. Next slide, please. This slide is showing how our revenue is distributed. Property taxes represent the majority of our revenue at 81%. Our state EPS funding, including debt service reimbursement, is at 14%, and then all other revenue is at 5%. And this remains similar to last year. Next slide, please. We saw earlier the increase in the property tax levy. This slide really shows the decrease in our state subsidy of approximately $947,000. And as our state equalized valuation increases, the state's assumption of our increased ability to pay for quality education results in a higher local expectation and a lower state contribution. In the all other section, we're showing that some of our smaller revenue sources have gone down. And our use of fund balance has decreased by approximately $60,000. And part of the increase in the use of the fund balance in FY21, this year's budget, was related to a one-time equipment purchase for food service that's no longer needed in FY22. And that basically is the change. Next slide, please. This next slide is showing our expenditure budget by broad categories. As noted earlier, our salary and benefits account for 79% of our expenditure budget. Contracted services, debt service, and supplies other are also shown here. And we will be reviewing these categories in a little greater detail as we move along. Next slide, please. So as it relates to just the salary and benefits expenditure, you can see that the larger portion of our salaries is related to teacher salaries at 48%. And our other salary portions of the pie include school support at 9%, ed techs at 6%, central office and other support at 5%, temporary salaries at 5%, and school administrators at 3%. So total salaries represent 76% of the total salary and benefits, with benefits representing 24%. Next slide, please. The FY22 expenditure budget in dollars is shown here. Total salary and benefits increased by $5,171,939, or 5.5%. And our total salary and benefits really represent COLA adjustments, our grade and step changes for the bargaining and non-bargaining groups. This includes all our stipends and differentials, all related benefits, and also includes all of our investments. And then our non-salary expenditures show an overall increase of $781,000, or 3.1% over last year's approved budget. And the next slide will show what our major expense drivers are. Next slide, please. So this slide is showing our major expense drivers. Debt service is showing the largest increase at $1.1 million at the very top. Natural gas and electricity are expected to decrease by $132,000. Our repair and maintenance services went down by $137,000. Our HVAC maintenance went up. Our property and liability insurance is expected to increase. Our expired computer leases were reduced. We were able to use CRF funding to fund tech devices and not extend the leases. And the decrease in capital equipment resulted from purchasing IT device replacements with federal funding as well. And we had also mentioned the one-time equipment purchase for food service in FY21 that we don't anticipate for FY22, contributed to part of that decrease. And then lastly, our special ed tuition and student-facing contractual services are up by $65,000. This increase is based on FY22 projections of student needs by our special ed department. And I believe that this concludes the financial portion. Are there any questions?
Let's see here. I see a hand. Hands have gone up quickly. I don't know who went first. It was Kate or April. Kate, I'll go with you first.
Well, thank you. I actually just wanted to ask, are these, well, I have several questions that I'm keeping track of. So I can wait until the end, knowing that this is specific to the financial portion that is being presented right now. Nick, how do you want to handle that?
Well, let me ask Kathy or Javier this. How many, what is next after this financial discussion?
Just very quickly, just talking about some of the key dates.
Okay.
So we could even save that to the very end, just because that's really the next steps.
Yeah. Okay. So yes, let's talk about the dates at the end, and why don't we jump in? So, Kate, if you had questions, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So first, really, just basic question is the slides that we're seeing tonight are not exact. We have a great presentation in our packet, but will these slides from this evening be made available so that we can go back through them?
Yeah.
Thank you. Second question is the 5.5% increase in salaries and benefits, the slide that Kathy was just on. Was that the same increase that was in the FY21 budget and other budgets, or is that a larger increase than last year for that particular line in the budget?
So, Kathy, help me to make sure that I'm tight on the numbers, but it's larger, and it's largely driven, the increase is largely driven by new positions that are part of the investments that you saw earlier. I think prior to the investments, this is where I'm not tight, Kathy, the the personnel increase was somewhere in the neighborhood of 2.2% or 2.5%, something along those lines.
Yes.
That helps. Thank you. And then my last question for the moment is with regard to the federal funds that will either remaining CARES Act funding or the ARP funding that has been identified, but I know there are still details to be learned in terms of use. I'm curious to know how those federal funds are being used specifically in this budget, and or how they're being contemplated to be used in this budget, and recognizing that they can also be used most likely in the next two budgets as well. So I think it would be useful just to see how those funds will be put toward investments that may or may not be ongoing, and also how they may be used potentially to offset some of the costs to the local budget this year, if possible.
Yeah, we have. We weren't going to do it today, but we can if this is something that you would want us to do. But we do have plans in place for the bulk of the funds that we currently have. The ESSERF is what it's called, federal funding that we've received to date. So we have, an allocation. Some of it is going to offset some costs that would otherwise have been in the baseline budget. Some of it is going to provide, for example, summer school for this year, a $2.5 million investment in additional programming for students over the course of this summer, as well as is allocated to specific things in that are associated with the initiatives that you saw. So, for example, one of the things that we're intending to pay for with federal funding is the license, the coursework that leads towards ELL licensure for our coaches and specialists. So those types of investments are also in there. Some of the professional development and stipends and things along those lines associated with the Wabanaki studies and Africana studies. Some of the stipends associated with the school level work on outdoor learning, things like that. We're looking to use our federal funding. So we have and I don't want to forget this one because it's important. Last year, one of the ways that we were able to arrive at a 0% increase was by moving a significant number of custodians that were working with us then and are working with us now are being funded out of that federal funding. And, we have $1.3 million of that federal funding in this year's budget and committed into the FY23 budget to actually support those positions going into the future as well.
Thank you.
Can I, before I go on, can I just ask a follow-up to that? Two simple questions. How much of, I can't remember what you called it,
Yes, sir.
Yes. How much of that is available to the school department, and how much is proposed to be used in this year's budget?
So roughly there's 7 million available, and 6 million is allocated for those things that we talked about.
So of 7 million in the new, whatever the letters were, all but about $1 million is programmed into this budget?
Correct, yes.
Okay,
and then we're expecting to receive an additional 14 million in this latest
I'm sorry, I wasn't clear. I meant the new money. So I apologize.
None of that money is in this budget.
So there's 14 million that just got passed by Congress, and that is there's none of that in what you've proposed so far. Okay, thank you. April, you are next.
Thank you. Just a quick question, and I'm trying to go back in the misty yesterdays of my remembering how the EPS formula works. So forgive me if I get this wrong. So if I remember correctly, for EPS formula, the valuation by town is done each year by Maine Revenue Service. And of course, now Portland will be going through revaluation. So I don't know if there's any explanation you can help with just understanding how those two might intersect, and does that change potentially our EPS at all? I see Brendan turned on his camera. Thank you, Brendan.
Brendan, are you going to take that?
So the state valuation and the local valuation are two separate and distinct items. So each year, the state valuation is set based on actual sales in the municipality, and it's about on a 12 to 18 month lag. So we're going to continue to see these large increases in the state valuation, which harm us in terms of revenue sharing, in EPS subsidy, and county tax. That's why I talk frequently about our TIFs and how using our TIFs can protect us from some of those value increases in the TIF areas. But the local revaluation is completely separate, and it will impact the mill rate. You know, once the revaluation passes, we'll be bringing our local valuation and it will more closely match the state valuation. The mill rate will drop in turn, but it doesn't necessarily change the amount of tax dollars that we need to collect. Is that helpful? Yes.
But can I just add one thing, which I think may be important to Ms. Fournier's question, is, you know, right, the state's valuation, which is what is the basis for the subsidy that we receive in EPS, is somewhere in the neighborhood of 11 billion for Portland, where Portland's current valuation, the one that you saw in one of Kathy's slide, is somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 point some billion. So there's a fairly significant lag in those two. Presumably, those will be closer together once the reassessment is done. But but that, I think, the sort of the key difference there is, from the state's perspective, we as a community have gone from 8 billion in 2016 to 11 billion in 2021. So we've seen a very, very steep increase in valuation.
Sorry, I was muted. April, you all set? Okay, Mark is next, followed by Belinda.
Xavier, thank you for a wonderful presentation on the budget. I appreciate the work everyone put into it. I also look forward to a discussion on the policies that underlie the discretionary spending that's reflected in this document. But I just wanted to get a moment from Kathy, if she could talk about the debt service. That's always a silent squeeze on a budget. And I want to understand what constitutes that debt service, and what's your sense of the trend line moving forward for that amount of money? Thank you.
And that's a great question. And I just received the full debt service schedule from the city, so I haven't really had a chance to analyze that, but that was one of the things that we definitely wanted to take a look at.
And then I think, Councilor, just in general, one of the things you saw in our presentation that it is up by $1 million this year. That is the first of what will be numerous subsequent increases in debt service associated with the $64 million bond to rebuild our 4 elementary schools. So that is, that's contemplated. It was what the voters approved when they supported that bond. So we will be seeing those types of increases added on to our debt service for the next 10 years. we will, obviously, and this is what I think Kathy was referring to and why we wanted to have the full sort of schedule, we will also have some other debt that rolls off. And so, we're looking, our board has asked for, a comprehensive analysis of what's coming on and what's coming off in the next few years. So we'll be in a better position shortly to be able to provide you that information.
Well, that's helpful. Thank you. I had an assumption some of it had to do with our initiation of school construction and what flows from that. But voters have a short memory. What they say yes to today, when it comes time to actually pay for it, they might remember what they agreed to in the past. So at least for this counselor, it would be helpful to get a breakout of what that debt service looks like so I can explain it to constituents if they bring it out. And as a former administrator, I just know that's a piece of the budget that has consequence on how much flexibility over time that you'll have around discretionary spending. So that was the rationale behind my question. And I appreciate your answer, and I'll look forward to a breakout in the future. Thank you.
Belinda and then Kate.
Thank you. Sorry, I was just distracted by the chat. Someone wanted us to stop sharing the screen, someone who's viewing, so that they could see people. Yeah, thanks. Okay, thank you very much for the presentation. It's really helpful. And as usual, I applaud all of your goals. I think they make a lot of sense. I always think they make a lot of sense. I do have just a couple of questions. Getting back to, I think Mayor Snyder just asked about the federal money, and then Councilor Mavadonis followed up with the $14 million that was just allocated. Do you kind of have a timeline for? I know this was just passed, so of course it was not factored into what you've presented. But do you have a timeline for how you might consider that and what sorts of investments you might be able to make? Anything you can offer there.
Yeah, we expect to know how much is allocated. We got something from the Department of Ed yesterday, and they said that they would tell us by the end of the week. So if we don't have an email sitting in my box now, tomorrow, I would imagine we'll know how much. We estimate, as I said, that it'll be in the neighborhood of 14 million. 20% of that is to be dedicated to summer. What the feds are calling learning loss, which is not the language that we prefer to use around that. But so we would envision continuing the type of investment that we're proposing to make this year out of the existing federal funds into summer learning opportunities for our students and extended learning opportunities over the course of the year. Involving our partners, involving community-based organizations that do that type of work. We envision doing that level of support for the next, for this summer and for the next 2 summers using federal funding. So that would be about $5 million of the 14 that would go towards that. There are some additional expenses that we don't fully understand at this point that would be associated with reopening school in the fall that, we obviously want to make sure that we are able to do. So any additional improvements in ventilation, things to support our outdoor learning, things along those lines, PPE, continued use of PPE and things like that. And then otherwise, I think that is a substantive policy conversation with the school board that we will need to engage in as we get past this budget and start looking into the next 2 years.
Thank you. As I said, I always find myself agreeing with all of the goals that you bring forward and wanting to support the full budget you bring forward. And then I always find myself conflicted in terms of costs to taxpayers, which I think everybody deals with. And last year we were getting ready for a revaluation, and then we wound up putting that off. And so that is coming, and it will decrease property taxes for some folks, but it will shift the burden around the city and it will increase for others. And so some folks, particularly in my district, are looking at really high tax increases, regardless of what any of us do with the budget, with the school or with the municipal budget. And so anything that I contemplate adding on top of that, I have to consider very carefully. I always think all of the goals are worthy. So there's never a judgment there. And it's also not my role as a counselor to determine how the money is spent. It's really just how much can we afford on both the municipal and the school side. So I did just have a question. People always mention enrollment. And when I was looking through, you had 2 enrollment scenarios, and one was a decrease of about 40 students overall to the district, and another one was an increase of, I think, 338. And I was just wondering how those enrollment projections impact your budget planning, if at all. I'm not sure, because I know that with an increase or with a decrease, it doesn't necessarily mean more staff or fewer staff, because there's not a linear correlation there. Like, you lose 5 students, it doesn't mean you can lose a classroom. So I just didn't know how those budget projections play in, or how those enrollment projections play into your budget. And I was hoping to understand that a little better.
So the reason that we have 2 is because as virtually every school district across the country has seen a decrease in enrollment under the pandemic, with students who've opted out altogether. And so I think that what you see in terms of those numbers is one where we're showing what our current enrollment is if those kids didn't come back. And the other one is, following our traditional trend line and just looking at, assuming that all of our students were to come back that went, homeschool or no school, if they all came back next year and they advanced a grade, which is the way that we normally do our projections, what would our enrollment look like? And, so that's why we wound up with the 2. I think, to your question, and in a normal year, we actually do look at that and we're able to make adjustments. If you looked at our budget last year, that we reduced, I don't remember if it was 2 or 3 elementary positions, because as we rolled those numbers up to the following year, we could project that we could actually reduce a class at Rowe Elementary or at East End Elementary based on what we were projecting. And those are always projections, and on a year-to-year basis, they materialize or they don't, and then we have to add people back or things along those lines. But we normally do. This year, with all of the uncertainty built into what that enrollment will be next year, we did not do any of those. We did not make any of those reductions that we would have made in a normal year.
Okay, thank you. I think I just had 2 more questions. The custodial staff that I know is partially paid for through, was it CARES Act or was it another acronym? I don't remember.
Now, it was CARES last year. It's now ESSER 1. So. Okay. So how are any of those additional because of the pandemic, those positions? No, those are all positions that were currently that were previously in place, and we just shifted them into federal funding last year.
Okay, so eventually they will, as federal funding runs out, they will have to come back into the regular operating budget as well. So I'm just going to keep that in my head. And then I think last question, in terms of the proposed investments that represent increases to the budget, are any of them one time or short term, or are they all ongoing?
We put most. We actually tried to shift anything in the budget that was a one-time only expense. We tried to shift into our federal funding. So when I talked earlier about some of the things that are in federal funding, we even went to the extreme, I guess, of just assuming that we will not have this building that I'm sitting in right now 2 years from now, and crediting ourselves the debt service associated with this building, because our intent is to put it on the market and to not have it. And so the savings associated with that, we actually are crediting our general fund, and we still have the building, so we have to pay the debt service on it. And so Kathy and her team are working, a bit of a sort of a way of doing that without, obviously, we can't pay our debt service on the federal grant, but we basically credited ourselves that in our general fund allocation. So we've done things like that, like our summer school. We traditionally spent about $140,000 on summer school, and we took that out of the budget because it's going to be funded out of that $2.5 million in federal funding.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for entertaining my questions.
Thanks, Belinda. Kate's next, and then Emily has her hand up, and then I'd like to jump in.
Thank you for letting me come back at this. And I apologize that I jumped right into questions before and didn't say thank you for the presentation. Good to see you all. I know that this has been such a rugged year. So thank you for everything that you do for our community and for the students in Portland. Every time I say that, I get choked up, but thank you. You're doing such good work. So Javier, my question has to do with kind of planning for the future. And so I've written a couple of things down because I think as we make our way through this process, it will be helpful to not only for us as a group to be thinking about the path forward, but also for community members to understand how Portland as a city and a school district are going to make our way through the use of federal funds and then away from federal funds. And so I'm thinking about how we may be able to help people see where federal funding is being invested and then how we plan to transition away from federal funding. Obviously, if it's a one-time infusion for infrastructure or something like that, it won't be ongoing. But in the case of the custodians, for example, how and when will those come back to the local budget? What will that figure be? I also think it's important to be thinking about that debt service for the 4 schools. I know that we only have 1 school showing up in the FY22 budget, but I do think that constituents may, benefit from seeing what we expect to be the impact to the debt service for the next 20 or so years, and the ramp up to that full 4 school figure versus the 1 at this point in time. And then, as you mentioned before, where does debt service roll off? So we may see a bit of an offset in the add and the minus. And then I think the other thing that's striking me as really important this evening is with additional investments, with the infusion of federal funding, where the salary and benefit line always increases the school budget so much, because that's the major, it is the major driver. It would be helpful, I think, to have some predictability in terms of what that annual increase is looking like. It's 5.5% right now in the proposed FY22 budget. Is that something that we should expect, or will there be a leveling off and it'll return to something more in the 3% range, like you said before? So I just think that if we're able to see beyond FY22 and look at some of these transitions, I think that would be really helpful. Again, because I think, as Councilor Ray said, I know that we're all mindful of the impacts of the revaluation and what that transition is going to look like for a lot of folks who live in Portland, renters and property owners alike. So I think that we're heading into a challenging spring, and people will be getting their revaluation notices right before the June 8th vote on the school budget. And so I just think it would be helpful to go through some of these kind of anticipatable impacts to the budget, both now and for the next several years, as we make our way through the impacts of this long-awaited reval. Thank you.
Emily was next, and then I'm going to jump in, and then Tay.
Thank you so much. Just on that last issue of debt service, I know Brendan had prepared some great slides for last year's budget season, looking at total existing city and school debt service, both excluding and including the pension and obligation bonds. It was looking out to FY30, including the 4 school bonds. And I think those slides are really informative. And so maybe we could bring those to our next meeting. And then I just also wanted to mention a couple of comparisons to other districts, other districts in the state, because I was very surprised when I learned at our last school finance committee meeting that Portland had one of the lowest changes in our school budget last year. So we had a 0% tax rate increase on our school budget. That wasn't the case in our surrounding communities. So Yarmouth, Brunswick, Cape Elizabeth, Scarborough, Gorham, Cumberland, Wyndham all had 5% increases, 5 or more percent increases in their FY20 to FY21 budgets. So just to give you a sense of what some districts around us, the decisions they have been making. And then I think you all know, but you'll remember that when you look at what we spend per pupil compared to our surrounding districts, we are in the immediate surrounding districts, we spend the least other than Westbrook. So just a reminder of kind of how we fare compared to our surrounding districts.
Thanks, Emily. I had a few questions, although many of them have been asked. Let me see if I can read my writing. I just wanted to follow up a little bit more on debt service. And if you know the number, Kathy, the total debt service for the district, and I know the increase was about 1.1 million. And if you don't have it handy, if we could just get it in a memo form to us so we could post it so everybody I know people can go into the budget and find it, but having it broken out so it's clear. Is that something you have handy, or?
I just have a bottom line for FY22.
Total debt service. How much is that?
Service, 9.5 million.
9.5, and that includes the additional 1.1?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Again, this may be in the backup, but how many new positions are there compared to last fiscal year, and what is the cost of that?
So there's 40 new positions. And I'm not sure that it's 40 or 41 or 39, but it's in the neighborhood. And then I don't know what the cost is. Kathy, do you?
And if you don't have it, if you
we can definitely get it for you.
Yeah, we can. It's really, most of that is salaries, I think, of the investments that we're adding to the budget.
So 40 additional positions over and above how many this year?
I don't have the budget book open right now, so I don't know that off.
And if you don't, that's fine. If you can just put it in that memo when you get.
You can see that, so, yeah.
And if you can just get that to me, and if you could also break out if it isn't broken out. I know this year you've taken on a number of additional staff due to COVID, and if you could, when you get us the number for the current fiscal year, if you could disaggregate it to the point that we know how many are. I don't need to know which positions, but how many are new positions that are specifically COVID related, and then the additional 40. That would be great. I'm sure staff did, but did staff or perhaps the committee hasn't gotten that far? But have you contemplated a list of reductions from the superintendent's proposed budget? And if so. So there hasn't been any contemplation of a reduction. Okay, I was going to say if there.
We've had one follow-up meeting as a committee since the budget presentation, and we're not voting it out of committee until April 2nd. So a little bit of time with it.
Yeah, just curious if you had a list. I was going to ask if we could see it. Sometimes I can't read my writing. Was there any, let me back up. Last year, before COVID, we had some discussions about the impact of revaluation as you were building the school budget. And then COVID came and everything went haywire. Was there any consideration given to the impact that was articulated before of the revaluation being implemented this year as you put your budget together?
Not. I mean, we're cognizant of, the fact that the city is moving forward with the reevaluation, but I don't know what what we would take into consideration from the reevaluation. We recognize that for some people, that it shifts it shifts taxes around. It doesn't change the amount of revenue that the school district needs or that the city needs to be able to run its programs. So we're cognizant of it. We're cognizant of the fact that it is, a significant challenge for the council in particular. But from our perspective, we don't know how it's changing, who's getting more, who's getting less. We know that it doesn't change the bottom line number of dollars that are needed to fund this budget or the city council's budget.
Okay, thanks. No, and I only ask because, what I think we all know who's been following it or been through revaluations is, you're right, the total budget doesn't change. Theoretically, a third stay the same, a third have a reduction, and a third have an increase. So the folks that are in the middle third or those that are getting an increase will definitely feel an impact of any tax increase. And I only asked the question because last year, Anna, Roberto, you, Javier, and I guess it was Miranda, and those of us on the city side had some conversations just about that while budgets were being built. So that's the only reason I ask about it. Let me see. I guess, as I said before, I'd be really interested in the 14.2 million. I get torn on this because I raised the issue last year, and I think it was Belinda or Kate raised it today with the custodians. It's we're using one-time funds for recurring costs, so that troubles me. However, the costs associated with 40 new positions and other programs also troubles me. And I agree with the comments that others have made that a great presentation and very needy. However, you entertain, I always say you guys entertain us as we ask questions about details. I haven't really asked a lot of the questions that usually get asked that are about policy and programming. But, we're the ones who ultimately have to decide on a total amount that we can support. And I have no idea where the council will be. I told people, I tell people in the public when they tell me Councilor so-and-so says in February they're going to support something, I said, well, wait till the budget comes forward in April and May, and then we'll see if they really do support it, because the rubber kind of hits the road. So for me, it's like I said, I don't like using one-time funds for recurring operating expenses. If in fact there's this need, maybe we have to look at that for, I'm sure you have things to program it for in the future, but at some point, all of this will come back on the property taxes. At this point, if the need is there, perhaps we need to use some federal funding, because I for one, will have a real hard time getting, I think, to be able to support this kind of an increase on the taxes. I know other communities may have gone up last year. The communities that we look to have far different demographics and ability to pay. I grew up in Yarmouth. I know exactly what it's like there. In fact, a couple of years ago when I asked, it turned out their per pupil cost was almost the same as Portland. And I don't know what it is today, but that was 2 or 3 years ago. So I just think I look around the city. We have every week I see more for lease signs in commercial properties. So I'm just worried how we get to this number, and I just put that out there as you're thinking about it. I'm sure some may not be surprised, but and I don't know where the council ends up on this or the city budget, but if the demonstrated need is there, I just think there's got to be some thought given to using additional federal funds versus the property taxpayers. So anyway, I'll stop there. I think others have already asked most of what I was going to ask. So who was next? Tay, I think, was next.
Yes. I'm just wondering if Corporation Counsel is here, because my wife works for the Portland school system, so I'm not sure if I'm allowed to participate in the budget process or not.
Tay,
and also, yeah.
I don't think we need Corporation Counsel, but yeah, my wife does too, and has for many years. So and Jack Dawson before me and others. So I think I'm not a lawyer, but I'm pretty sure you can participate.
Okay. Because in other situations I couldn't, but I just wanted to know. All right, great. Thank you.
I think April was next, but I'm not 100% sure.
I can't remember either. I just saw lots of hands go up. I just have to go back also and say I was remiss in saying thank you to the board and school staff. This is just such a tremendous amount of work that you had to do to bring this together over what is, I think we all say, unprecedented, and we can't say it enough because we couldn't have anticipated this year. And so I think I don't really have any questions, but I feel like I had to at least say this, that, this time last year, we were just going home and we were hoping it was going to be 1 week, 2 week. We're now a year later, and the amount of work and lift we're going to be asking of our schools this fall and everyone coming back is unprecedented. Just as a special educator, I can only imagine what resources are going to be required for these students re-entering school full-time. I know my own child has autism, and having, interruptions in routines, having, the predictability change, requires a significant amount of work on behalf of the teachers, the ed techs, and all of the specialists that support him on the other end at school to just catch him back up to where he was when one of those interruptions happened, let alone a year of interruptions. And he is a high functioning, almost 13-year-old who has had a tremendous amount of success, but there are lots of other students that have not had the benefit of 2 working parents, consistent Wi-Fi, consistent food and employment and resources that have helped navigate this last year. And so I also want to respect that it is a significant investment, and it's a big ask on top of an already big ask that we have for our community. So I just want to really keep it at the front that when we're bringing these students and teachers back, there is a lot of recovery that's going to have to happen from a social emotional perspective, from a routines perspective, from a curriculum recovery perspective. And I think what this budget for me represents the closing of some of the equity gaps that have happened within this last year and a half, as well as an investment in and a recognition of the things that we're going to have to do to really get our community and our students back to where they were when we all went home. So I really felt like I needed to share that, and I really appreciate both sides of it. I'm also a homeowner, so I know the tax impact to this and recognize how hard it can be to shoulder that burden as a homeowner too. So thank you so much for all you guys are doing.
Thanks, April. I'm guessing this order. I think it's Andrew, Belinda, and then Roberto.
Belinda was before me.
Okay, then Belinda. Thanks, Andrew.
I'm fine with any order. I'm here. So
they all went up quick.
Speaking of the comps from town to town, I didn't see those. Usually I do see those. So I was just wondering if someone could provide those. The most recent I can get online is FY 2019. So I don't know if you have more recent than that. That would be great to see. I do always like to look at that. And then my final thing was also a thank you to everybody. And I want to acknowledge the very, very difficult decisions that you have had to make over the last year. And I think, there is always community talk about whether people agree or disagree with the decisions that are being made. And I want to say, I know that you have been incredibly thoughtful. I know that your goals are to provide the best education that you can safely for our students here in Portland. I know that you want to get people back to school as quickly as you can, respecting the safety of teacher and students. And you have my absolute full support for the decisions that you have made. I really respect how thoughtful you have been and how creative. And it's been wonderful. You've been able to offer people a couple of different models, but just you've been in the hot seat, and I recognize that. And thank you for all that you've been doing.
Thanks, Belinda. Andrew?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, thank you so much for this intentional and, Superintendent Botana said, early on, it is often said that a budget is a representation of your values. And we talk a lot, especially in this past year, doing the work and what the work looks like. And in terms of public policy and budgeting, this is what the work looks like. You are responding to an unprecedented, as we've established, need in our community, and you're going big, and it's bold. And yeah, it's overwhelming. There's a lot of needs at the municipal level right now, but we have very specific investments that we need to be making in the kids who go to school here, specifically, ELL and BIPOC students. So going over this, this is my first budget process on any level as a new counselor. So I was going to, observe and be quiet, but I just had to say thank you so much for the amount of work, just to echo some of my colleagues. One thing, not to get too in the weeds, but I think an opportunity as we're all looking at how this is going to impact, our tax dollars, especially with the revaluation that, we're talking about more and more every day, is when I look at the expenditure budget, how much of, and I spoke with, Emily, I think a few months ago about it, how much of your budget do you, when it comes to procurement, printing, binding, photocopying, there's, pretty much that entire page, how much of it can you intentionally redirect into the local economy so that you're prioritizing, Portland businesses, which we know that goes right into local wages. For every dollar spent locally, we know 70 something cents, stays there. I would just be curious if you have an internal policy at all, at the Portland Public School level when it comes to procurement and spending. But overall, I think that this advancing equity, utmost priority, but the recovery and the acceleration, I think, is looking into what next year's budget is going to look like. The year after that, we're going to slowly come out of this pandemic, and to have a path forward now is going to be key to success, and ultimately, I think, save us money down the road because we're prioritizing those needs now. So yes, thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. Roberto was next, and then Emily.
Thank you, Councilor Mavadonis. I hope that wraps up the questions and comments from the council, because I was hoping that I'd just add some comments in closing before we finish the presentation with the timeline review.
Please do.
Okay, so first of all, I want to thank you for your time and your acknowledgement of the hard work, and I'll dare to repeat it, unprecedented circumstances that public education, not just Portland Public Schools, but public education in general, has experienced since the onset of the pandemic. I truly appreciate your attention, and again want to highlight your acknowledgement of the additional work that is required to meet the needs of our students under the pandemic. But I want to also offer you an opportunity to view this a bit differently. As Superintendent said, this budget is very purposely trying to advance equity or equity initiatives. And so when we view at what we have to advance, or rather the ground that we need to make up, we have to historically, we have to acknowledge that we've not made significant investments in these areas in Portland Public Schools, and therefore we are lagging behind in the ground that we have to make up. Last year, when that gap got even wider because of the pandemic, we, even though we're able to advance on small investments, we passed a 0% tax increase. So when it hit the fan, we were able to figure out how to spare the city residents, the taxpayers of the city, a tax increase. And yet we still struggled, and we fought to try to meet the needs of our students. So that's commendable. So I appreciate that councilors were able to recognize that today. On the last thing that I wanted to say, because I wanted to add some content to it, when the school board and the finance committee from the school department discuss the debt service and how that, and we've been discussing this for some time because we knew that, we've known for a long time that this was going to show up in our budgets. I guess the silver lining that I always found in those discussions was that we could always go back and reflect on that bond, that referendum, that it was passed with an overwhelming majority. So when we do reference that back, like Councillor Dion had a really good, but because voters have a short-term memory, right? So you do have to remind them. But this is one of those pleasant reminders that you tell them. Remember when very enthusiastically and overwhelmingly the city's residents passed this because they believed that this was a worth investment. So it's a pleasant reminder in my opinion. Although admittedly it's a consequential one to our budget, so it is an important one. But again, I think that when you remind people of this, they'll say, well, that's worth being in the budget as well. They'll agree with that because they did when they voted for it. So having said all that, we have another one of these joint meetings coming up. So I look forward to that. We'll see where we are in terms of the development of our budget. But I look forward to continuing this collaborative work and to be as transparent as possible with our residents and with each other on what we're doing in our schools. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the rest of our work.
Thanks, Roberto. Emily.
Thank you so much. And Mr. Rodriguez said much of what I wanted to say more articulately than I will say it. But, just to reiterate, because I think in a budget like this, we looked at so many numbers and we talked about many different initiatives. And I do want to just step back again to talk about what we're trying to do here. And at the beginning of the superintendent's presentation, he started off with a couple of slides that looked at achievement, English language arts and math achievement, that showed that our students of color are 30 and 40 points behind our white students. And what we have to grapple with as city leaders is whether we're okay with that. Are we going to allow our students of color to continue to fall through the cracks? Or are we going to, as this budget envisions, put equity at the center of what we do and not do what we've been doing in the past, but provide a different education for our students that starts to provide a more equitable education that is in line with the values of our community. And so I think that really is the core that this that is envisioned in this budget. And I really appreciate the conversation tonight and look forward to this process over the next few weeks and months as we finalize this budget and put it before the voters. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Emily. Anna?
Thank you. So I just wanted to chime in just to add on to what my colleagues have already said. I wanted to thank the council, first of all. I recognize that you're faced with a question of affordability. You know, that's always the question that we face at this point. I've kind of actually become a senior member on this board, so we've seen this again and again every year. We have great needs as an organization. The city has competing needs, and we have to kind of balance those and figure out what we can afford. So I appreciate your continued support for our vision and for your work to support us to the greatest extent that you can. I think that earlier, I think, Nick, you talked about the demonstration of needs. And I do feel that in this budget, the need is demonstrated. I recognize that, a 6% tax increase is, pushing the upper portion of the envelope in terms of historically the level of tolerance for a tax increase on an annual basis. But for me, for this budget, I think there's kind of three compounding factors that particularly justify it. And it's, first of all, that without any increase last year, we weren't able to make the equity investments that we've become specifically laser focused on in terms of our strategic plan for the district. So we had to kind of press pause on our strategic plan and make up for a deficit in state funding last year. This year, we're faced with another deficit in state funding of almost $1 million. And then thirdly, we're combining that with the compounding effects that the pandemic has had on need. So we're seeing, as Javier pointed out, what the federal government calls learning loss, and we're trying to recoup and make up for that. It has even set back farther our goals towards equity for our community. So to me, that's the justification of why I'm feeling like the need is definitely supported in terms of the number of where we are at this budget at this point in time. But again, I know that that's a question that the council has to grapple with, and I appreciate your willingness to hear us out on this and have this conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna, and thanks to all of you. The administrative staff and the school board for the work you've done on this already. As we've pointed out, it's a great presentation. We just need to deal with the financial side of it on our end. And it's been very helpful to get the presentation and to, have a chance to ask some questions and get some answers. And we'll get some more, I know, in follow-up. And if we do, as counselors, come up with some information, we'll pass them along, likely through Brendan, if anybody has anything. So we look forward to talking with you more about this. And Javier, or I don't know who's controlling the screen. We did have the dates up. Do you want to go back to those quickly, just so everybody's on the same page? Thank you.
So, oops, I'm not wanting to share this with you. I'm just wanting to present it. Okay. So these are the sort of the key points along the overall budget process. The March 16th was when we introduced this budget. The school board is scheduled to vote on it on April 13th. It then comes to the council, and you're scheduled to vote on it on May 17th. And then, as I think Councilor Mavadonis mentioned, June 8th is the public vote. Some of the key points in the short term that we wanted to highlight. We had our first Board Finance Committee on the 18th and second one on the 22nd. We are now here in the Joint Finance Committee. The School Board's Finance Committee meets again on April 1st. And our next meeting with jointly with you is scheduled for April 8th. So those are the sort of the upcoming key dates, and we just wanted to put those in front of everyone and remind you. Again, I'll add my 2 cents. I really appreciate the feedback today. We've got a number of takeaways in terms of things that we need to pull together to answer questions, and we will do that. And we'll definitely have them for April 8th and start getting them to you along the way through Brendan and City Manager Jennings. So again, just from my standpoint, thank you all for listening to what we have to say. And, obviously we're cognizant of the challenge that it always is to bring a budget that asks for an increase. And, we look forward to continuing that conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Javier. And I will say you guys are always quick to get us responses. So thank you for that. So
can I just mention, I think that the May 17th date, I think, has been changed to May 10th for the council vote.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
So.
Okay. Well, we have a city item that you're welcome to stay. Any of you that want to listen to, it's about the recovery fund dollars. But we won't be surprised if we see a lot of people leave the meeting. So again, thank you all for being here.